This episode is in partnership with Authority Magazine. Authority Magazine, a Medium publication, is devoted to sharing in-depth and interesting interviews featuring people who are authorities in business, pop culture, wellness, social impact, and tech. For 30 years, our next guest has practiced his passion in the classroom.
Adam Patric Miller is an award-winning teacher, author, and essayist who often writes about the students he loves.
And as we know, helping the next generation navigate today's world is perhaps more important than ever. Adam, welcome to Believe in People.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listen, why does anyone in their right mind become a teacher? Silence.
Well, first of all, I had to think of the idea of the right mind, and I think
that's
maybe
right.
it's true, and I think that maybe it's when I'm mostly in my right mind that I think I do want to teach. I think when one looks around the world and sees what needs to be done, and this is because it makes me think about why I got into teaching back in the very beginning. I thought of all the things that I could do that would probably do the least amount of harm. It seemed like teaching would be a good job to pursue. And yeah, I think working with young people and dealing with, as you know, I'm a writer and I'm deeply connected to literature. I love talking about books and thinking about what that means to read and to write, and hopefully today to maybe even speak clearly about these things. That would seem like a pretty good vocation, to do that, to actually get paid to go and help other people enjoy what I enjoy so much.
And Adam, was it so your love of, I mean, it's language. Is it language because of writing, speaking, teaching English, and also you're a professional violinist, and that's sort of that language that it's still language. Is that sort of the intrigue when you were young, or how young, or when did that come about? That sort of mix.
Well, it's all about sound, and yeah, for sure. When I was a kid, the first thing I remember, and I grew up in Connecticut, in Westport, Connecticut, and we had a music program there. And I remember one of the things they did was they brought us on to the gymnasium and they had some kids play instruments for us. And this is about the language of music. I would never have said that when I was a kid. I was just using my ears. And I heard a guy he was in sixth grade and he played the violin. And immediately I went home and said, I want one of those.
Wow.
And that led me on a path. I mean, I've been playing the violin since then. For many, many, many years. And I did pursue that eventually professionally. In fact, the young man who was in sixth grade, he went on to Juilliard, and he ended up being principal violist of the Chicago Lyric Orchestra, I think.
Oh.
He was a musical, brilliant person. And so I really wanted to pursue music. I went to, when I arrived in college, actually, I went to Princeton University. And when I got there, I really just wanted to play the violin. And then I dropped out to pursue it professionally, just because it was the sound. It was listening to, being in orchestra and hearing Debussy's Trois Nocturnes or something like that, just being so immersed and thinking, I have to get closer to this sound. Like, what is this? And I spent a couple of years studying with a great Russian violinist, Albert Markov. Got a chance to play on stage with him at Carnegie Hall.
Wow.
So I had incredible, these very rich experiences. And it was all connected, like you said, to the language of music and getting that to happen on my violin. And after a couple of years if anyone knows anything about the Russian violin school, it insists on 8 hours of practice a day.
Wow.
Total discipline, all lessons done from memory. I'd never really experienced anything like that, but it just taught me so much. But after a couple of years with Mr. Markov, I was thinking, well, my trajectory here isn't to be a soloist, which interested me. And I was really interested in the language, the composition of music, and I didn't have what I'd call the composer's ear.
Hmm.
And then I thought, well, this isn't working out the way I thought it might. And what I did was I left and went back to Princeton University. And it was a confusing time for me, I'll say. But at one point, I remember opening a book of William Blake's poetry. Uh, it was called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And I remember starting reading some of those lines, especially one, without contraries is no progression. And something
Oh, that's
clicked in
interesting.
my head. It was, and then after reading those lines, I literally started writing what would be my first poems.
Hmm.
And that's how I kind of found myself as a writer. And I knew, because to me that the combination of words in the right order is making a sound in my ear that made me feel joyful or connected, whatever you want to say, that I was like, I have to pursue this, and I could be creative doing it. I felt maybe with the violin, I could have been in a great string quartet, perhaps, or have been in a wonderful symphony orchestra, but I wanted to make stuff, create, and the writing was the way to go. And so that started me writing poetry and eventually starting to publish some things here and there. And when I left, I hope this isn't going on too long. Cut me off anytime you like. But when I graduated with a degree in English literature, I got in an apartment room and I just started writing. I waited tables and waited for 3 years. That's all I wanted to do.
Wow.
And I had absolutely no success. It was I was
Not yet.
experimenting. Yeah, well, part of it was I was young and ridiculous, and I was thinking, and I'll share a ridiculous thought. I was thinking I was also quite obsessed with visual art and painting. My biological father was a painter, an artist.
You're a romantic.
Maybe it's a little bit of the romantic, but I was really interested in Jackson Pollock's paintings and thinking, I can do this with words.
That's
Yeah, I know. People always say, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. And how do you make that happen? And so I was writing very abstract things with language to me as music. Honestly, this goes back to your original question, which is about the language. I was trying to make music with words. It's just that I think the meaning was so abstract and so idiosyncratic that, it might get published. It did some parts got published in very kind of avant-garde journals and things like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
But
So
these
yeah.
this period of time where you were in the one bedroom apartment or whatever, I
Yeah.
mean, that's an education in and of itself, is it not? It's a different kind of education. But you talk of the mentors that you had, you talk of your love, this passion that you have for music, writing, language, William Blake.
Mhm.
You're passing that on to the next generation, the up and coming
Well,
next.
thank you so much. It's really nice of you to say that. And I hope the one thing, I wonder what makes anyone a successful teacher, but I think if you're sharing this passion, this deep love of something, I think students tend to notice it. And I've never, every single day, even today, I went into work absolutely excited to share I'll just tell you one book and it's only the second year I've taught it. It's Marjane Satrapi's graphic novel called Persepolis. And I just think I think it's magical. I think she's actually magical. If you've ever heard her interviewed, she's a wonderful, just artist all the way. But to be able to share that with my students, and I don't know if you know much about graphic novels, but I was originally
A lot of kids read Mouse, for example.
they read Mouse, and a lot of kids are into manga. But I was a little bit of a naysayer. I'm very old school. I mean, my background in literature is pretty heavy duty, and I
Yeah,
love, for example, students reading George Orwell's 1984, or we read this year Margaret Atwood's Canadian, speaking of wonderful Canadian artists,
yes.
The Handmaid's Tale,
sure.
serious stuff. But when I give this graphic novel to my students, I see some students who never really want to read. I look down, they've read 30 pages.
Wow.
It sets them on fire. And I think that's the job,
And that's a
education is not a pit.
satisfaction.
Yeah, just get it going, get them excited.
And I mean, and so you think about, you've had what, 30 years? You've been teaching for about 30 years,
You
Adam?
have outed me. You've outed my age.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, I actually think it takes a few years to get good at it, but I started teaching. My first full-time job was in 1992. People can do the math.
Hmm.
I did leave teaching for a few years when I worked in artist management and applied some of my classical music know-how for a few years. But for anyone who's counting, I think I'm finishing my actual 27th year of teaching, but it should have been over 30 if I just kept straight on going. But I moved around, taught in Connecticut, moved to Columbus, Ohio, taught there for years, and now I'm finishing my 15th year in St. Louis.
Well, and what have you noticed then, having taught for so long? I imagine there have been any noticeable changes or differences in the way students experience, not only your class, but sort of the good, bad, and the ugly in school, the school experience itself? Like, do you have any feelings around that or thinking?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, to help me think about that, Amy, for a second, the number one shift is the iPhone. I would say, and there's lots of people who have written about it, but it's interesting just going into a classroom, say with 16-year-olds, and they come in almost as though they're in prayer, but they're actually just looking down at their cell phone. And then they go to their seats and they're still in this kind of prayerful position. And it doesn't matter if we say every single day, please put yourself, and I do every single class for now for years. That's something that I say to so many students many times. And I think that the fact that my students now are on screens, just like we're on screens right now. But I mean, I grew up with an analog brain. Maybe you both did too.
We did.
Kevin did for sure.
I did.
Okay. Well, and so that's when we played music on vinyl and the world sounded different and clocks went around in circles. But for students, they are digital brains. And so the way they interact with media or even an actual, a book almost seems like some old technology to them. So because they would rather read on their computer, they would rather listen to books on tape piped into their ears because they have these really, little things. I'm also like, please take things out of your ears. They're like, we're not listening, to our music. I said, but still, I just want to see open ears because that'll be possibly helpful to the process. So the major change is trying to convince students to maybe listen to me. Look at me, your teacher, because I think there's something profound about a human being talking to another human being about something like, how's a sentence put together? Why should we know how to do that? Why should we read The Catcher in the Rye, as outdated as it is, about a super wealthy white kid living in Manhattan who, guess what, may actually have some serious problems? Why bother? Or read Richard Wright's Black Boy, another book which I love to teach. And why do we need to know about the Jim Crow South? Like, this stuff we need to know it now. And as soon as I have them involved in the book, I would say, that's one thing that has never changed. If students love being in an environment, I think, with someone who's excited and enthusiastic and knowledgeable and can actually help them make the connection about why they need to know this stuff and get better at reading and writing. And like I said, maybe even speaking, although I'm not the greatest. Remember, I'm a writer. I would rather spend time writing something and then adjusting it 1,000 times before I send it out for someone else to read.
As
So
we're from a different generation, I just want to ask, do you think the fact that, and then we're going to get off the topic of the iPhone because we could spend hours, but
yep,
do you think that these mobile devices somehow affect the way they interact with other people?
absolutely. I should pause and think about that, but because actually meeting someone face to face and looking someone,
In the
just
eye.
in the eyes, like even
Doesn't
now
happen
we're
anymore.
on screens. For me, that is the ultimate transmission that must take place. And I do find that even if they look up, it's almost as though their eyes are still glazed by the technology. And I have to break through that a little bit. I grew up and I was very lucky because I had some amazing teachers. I think that's, you said, why in a straight thinking way would you ever want to be a teacher? And I think that's, if you're fortunate enough to ever actually meet a real live teacher, they're out there. It's such a catalyzing, profound and motivating experience that you think, wow, if you've got that in you, then you should probably give back like someone gave back to you.
Yep.
Yeah, and so for me, I had, say, violin teachers. I remember one, John Heweiler, from the time I was a little guy. He worked with me, and it was so, first of all, he was a master violinist. He'd studied at Yale graduate school. He was a concert master of orchestras. He's incredible. So he could play a violin, and as soon as I heard it, I wanted to do that. That's very one-to-one. But also the actual interaction of knowing I would look at him, he would give me cues. If I was studying something that was a really hard passage for me, and I always think this applies to teaching because everyone struggles. Reading is difficult, writing is really difficult. But he would say, you know what, Adam, put the violin down for a second. And he had a jar with sour balls in it, I remember. And he'd give me a sour ball, and we just kind of sit there. He taught at this was New Canaan Country Day School, I remember. I went to public school. That was a private school. And we would just kind of look out the window and see the sun setting, and it's just that kind of back and forth interaction. There was not a screen in sight. And then I could go back and then maybe I would gain some mastery over skill, just over the relaxation or just taking a break. Because he knew from seeing me and I knew from talking to him, it was time just to relax and everything is fine. And for the kids, I think because of the constant screens, I think they experience there's high levels of anxiety. Many of my students come to school, I hate to say this, but they're medicated. Because they're just stressed. There's so much stress. I will add the shooter drills, for example.
Oh my
That
God.
we deal with. Yeah, I mean, you can just put layer upon layer, and they're also getting constant updates on their phones about even if a grade change, you'll hear a bell ring. I hear that bell ring, and I always think, oh, and an angel just got his wings, like.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, it's a kid just found out that she got a B minus, and then her face just goes down,
Right.
because this is too much. So,
And then, of course, I'm not encouraging anyone not to go to school or anything, but some of the greatest minds in our computerized world actually didn't graduate from college and stuff. But I'm certainly not suggesting that everyone is Steve Jobs in our world. There is only one Steve Jobs. You write about some of these students.
oh yeah,
Some of the essays that you've written have really touched me about, one in particular about this kid who lost his life. I mean, there's a lot of kids out there in challenging situations, which you sort of just alluded to in some ways with regards to stress or the fact that everything is in your grade. And if you don't get the grade, then you're not going to get into the big. But
you got it.
some of these kids really struggle. And that has touched you.
Yeah, I mean, it stays with me pretty much for the rest of my life. I think one thing, again, the beautiful thing about teaching is that you get to meet young people and every single one of them has some kind of a shining talent if you have the eyes to see it. It might not actually be in your subject. And part of becoming really good is recognizing that some student might actually love dance or visual art. Often I talk to students about music. That's sometimes I end up maybe wasting a little too much of our time on writing, talking about, a great jazz musician or something that they like. But at the same time, students often are in conflict, and and there are times when, as a teacher, you have to recognize that, and you need to act in a kind of compassionate way and do what you can. At the same time, for anyone who's interested in teaching, you have to also realize there's actually a limitation. There's the hardest thing for me to learn is that my limitations are vast. I try to do well, but yeah, you can't undo certain things that arrive with your students. How's that? And depending on the teaching environment, and as you may know, I started for years teaching in what people call an inner city environment, where my students were living below poverty line. Teachers can't, it's so ridiculous to see teachers are supposed to solve the problems that come into your classroom when those problems are set up. They're so structurally baked in that a student comes in deeply upset about something, or like my students would show up. I remember when I first started teaching, I bought students these steno pads because I love starting the class with a daily quotation. I've done that my entire career. And I noticed a lot of them didn't have notebooks. So I gave them steno pads, and so that they could do the daily quote, which is a nice way to start a class. And I just kept noticing all my students kept scrawling "rest in peace" all over their steno pads, all of them, because all of them in this city is Bridgeport, Connecticut. At that time in the 1990s, again, yes, I'm pretty old. I've been teaching for a long time, but it was the height of the crack cocaine epidemic then, and kids were dying on the street all the time, and they all had relatives and close friends and family who were, bad things were happening. And so then how do you teach? It was, yeah. So, gee, I don't even know if I'm answering your question, but
Well, you are in a way, but if I can go on just to say that
sure, please do.
the steno pad allowed them a way to express themselves. So they may not have been writing down your quotation, but they were writing down "rest in peace," and and that was perhaps
Yeah.
a way to express their own sadness, sorrow, sense of loss, or whatever.
I will add that when I was there, and it's so essential. And again, it's what makes me want to keep teaching at all times, because this is for every kid in every city. It doesn't matter. You can be in a wealthy suburb, doesn't matter. But giving students the opportunity to write about it makes the difference. And back in Bridgeport, I remember we started up a literary magazine, which actually the students named it. That was the good part. They called it Truce Magazine. And in Truce Magazine, this is from creative writing class, students got to write what they needed to write about people they'd lost and about what they saw. And many of those students transformed things that I know I could not have handled into works of art that would move anyone. If I had that, I actually still have some of the old copies of that magazine. If I were to share any poem from there, I'm sure that anybody would be moved immediately by that direct communication through, again, the language, through words. Yeah.
And Adam, what have you learned from I'm sure many things, but what have you learned, or what stands out to you? What have you learned from some of your students?
Okay. When I first started teaching at Bridgeport, I remember I had a wonderful barber. So I grew up in Westport, Connecticut, which is about 10-minute drive from Bridgeport. Westport is one of the, per capita, it became an extremely wealthy place to live. Not when I was a little kid, but as I became an adult. I mean, Paul Newman lived there, Tom Cruise had a house, Martha Stewart had a house in Westport, and just about 10 minutes away was Bridgeport, which was, again, a kind of inner city place where people were living below the poverty line. That's one of the strange things about Westport, where that extreme wealth is next to extreme poverty. But my barber I got to know him over many years, but he was in Westport. And he was such a nice guy. He was always very kind to me, and he was cutting my hair. And I remember telling him, his name was Mike. I said, "Mike, I got a job in Bridgeport." And Mike said, "Adam, you're going to work in Bridgeport. You're not going to teach those kids. They're going to teach you."
Wow.
And he was speaking truth. He knew what I did not know. And from the moment, that was my 6 years in that school, my students taught me everything that I need to know about being a teacher. And most of that is that I don't really know too much, and I have to really listen to what students need to know. And students actually, in a weird way, they kind of teach you how you have to teach if you're paying close attention. If not, if you have an agenda and you go in there and you think, I'm going to teach you iambic pentameter, and you look around your class and it's not going to happen unless you have a rationalization. Or as my students taught me, they would say immediately, because there was so much failure, that school had a 50% dropout rate. By the, only half the class from freshman year, senior year would graduate, and your class would change all the time because kids were living in transient population. But my students would say, why are we learning this? They had other things to attend to that were much more pressing, and I had to come up with a reason and that's the thing that's held, because every day I say, yeah, if I'm teaching Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, why am I teaching that? Why do they need to know that? And for the sake of speaking of iambic pentameter, if I'm going to teach Shakespeare in 2024, I have to answer that question every time and do it in a meaningful way. And I would say I'm somewhat successful at this point with that.
Just because we are almost out of time, but have they made you a better human being?
Oh, I wasn't a human being until I'm sorry to laugh, but better than tears, I would say. But I remember I didn't know what a human being was, I would say, until my first son was born. And I think if you've ever been lucky, if you have kids, there's something about having your own children that deepens the sense of being actually a human being. But I would say for the students, getting to know them over the years, they actually forced me to confront myself as being a human being and think deeply about what that means every single day. And I'm happy to say, like, even I already taught all day today, for the record. And when I went in there, when I saw my students, I felt I'll admit this, a kind of joyful, giddiness that I'm going to get to do some teaching. They might not be happy to see me because, I'm giving them a quiz on some reading and holding them accountable and things like that. But that human thing comes from teaching them and knowing it's always available. It's available to me if I'm open to it. And it's really terrific if they let that happen in the class. And when it does, it's a fantastic moment. And I look for that all the time.
So I would say, Adam, you believe in people. Why is that?
Well, I will say this, that going in and teaching is the one thing that keeps me optimistic. I guess I didn't talk too much about the writing, because the writing brain that I have can sometimes shade into some cynicism and looking at some darker things at times, because that's the way my literary part of my head works. But
actually, that's right. I want to mention A Greater Monster.
Thank you. Oh, well, that's a collection of personal essays, which do actually talk about teaching and also about my sessions with music and like Glenn Gould and playing Bach and all those things. So yeah, that's a book that is out there. Autumn House Press in Pittsburgh published that. So they did a beautiful job. That book is available. But I was thinking that the writing side, being alone and writing is a solitary act, and it can lead towards certain dark reflections, which I think are probably necessary to bring back. But teaching is it teaches me actually to believe in people. That's the show that you have, but it's that I have to be optimistic when I'm teaching. I feel that when I'm engaged in it, and the students always, and if I'm ever down, you wouldn't believe, students always come to me and they reach out to me in all kinds of fun ways that help me, if you can believe it, believe in people, when sometimes there's some counter evidence with the way people behave. But not that, I don't see that so much in school.
That's good to hear.
Patric Miller, writer, teacher, musician, and believer in people. Thanks so much for spending
an all-round great
today.
Guy.
And good guy.
That's sweet of you. Thank you so much for having me here. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Adam, so much.
Okay.
Well, I'd just like to thank Adam again for coming on to talk about his passion for teaching. And it is interesting that he mentions that it was a series of mentors that helped him along, and he's passing that along to kids in the schools that he teaches in now. And I think that's the most important thing of all, is that there are still people out there that young people can look up to and perhaps find a path, a way to go.
And I think now more than ever, Kev, it's that is important for students in particular to have that understanding that there are people out there that are wanting to help and inspire, and just to sort of keep an open mind, because there are opportunities if you just look around. And he's a very inspiring teacher. So if you've enjoyed this or been inspired by this episode, we encourage you to subscribe to Believe in People. Thank you so much.
See you again.